Hello. How's everybody? Kicking? Y'all ready to get started? Because we got some thinking to do today, okay? This is going to be a required brain process Sunday. Is everybody ready? You wake up! Today I want to talk about this week, what's coming up this week. I think so many times we get caught up in holidays and seasons and we forget exactly what this whole thing is about. This is the holiest week of the year. This is the week that all of time and all of humanity was hinged on. And it's maybe bigger than just getting a day off work or day out of school. Just maybe, right? So I want to talk to you today about what this week is about, and the goal here is that as we go out this week and as we go through this week, that we're reminded of exactly what it is that's going on. I think so many times we get this idea that Jesus and the Bible was like a fairy tale, or it was like a fictional book, or just something that doesn't really connect or relate. But the truth is, these are real people. This is a real event. These are real things that happen in a real place. It's still here. It's a real place in a real time. And it really, really matters to us. So I hope that we get that across. I hope that today you learn some stuff. I hope that today you're able to take some stuff with you. And that it'll change the way you think about this week. I'm going to start out in Exodus chapter 12. Now, what's going on in Exodus chapter 12 is mankind began in heaven. Is that okay with everybody? Like, Eden literally means garden of heaven. Okay? So as God created mankind, He created us in relationship with Him in the garden of heaven. And what had happened in the garden of heaven was life was good. Man walked with God. There was nothing between man and God, and everything was great. But sin came into the picture. Temptation came into the picture, and mankind fell in his relationship with God. And so mankind was expelled from the garden of heaven into the world that we have now, which is a physical world. Mankind was separated from God. God was there in heaven, and mankind was here on earth and in the physical realm and operating in the flesh and disease and pain and suffering and struggle and wild animals and things trying to eat you and kill you. And all of this was going on in this realm, and God was there, and mankind and God were separated. But God's love for mankind and God's passion for mankind hadn't changed. So God made covenants with people. He entered into a covenant with Abraham that He would redeem mankind through His seed. Now as the family of Israel began to develop throughout the book of Genesis, as the family of God began to develop, we began to see this picture that there was this in and this out. There was the family of God, the children of God, the children of Israel. Then there were the outsiders, those who were Gentiles or Greeks. It's called different things in the Bible, the pagans, the world. And they were at war with each other, and God had separated them, and He had taught them to stay separate from this group. But as the story begins, we see this type and shadow of the people of God, or the people that were from Eden, the people that were rooted from Eden, that they found themselves enslaved and in bondage. They weren't fully alive. They weren't sozo, saved, whole, and complete. They were very broken, and they were under suppression and under rule. And so they were slaves in a foreign land, a land they were never supposed to be in. They weren't in the land of the promise, but they were in the land of Egypt. And Egypt was a type and a shadow of the world. And the children of God didn't belong in the world. They belonged in Eden, which was the promised land, or heaven's land, or the land of God and his children. So we see the top and the shadow of the big picture playing out, right? Not in the details, but like we look and we see the big scope and the big picture. And so what God does is after a certain time, God sends a Savior. Someone to deliver, to take these children of the promise, of the covenant, and to remove them from slavery and bondage, and to save them or make them a whole and complete nation, and deliver them to the kingdom, or to Jerusalem, or to the promised land of Israel, where they were destined to be. So God sends a Savior, and the Savior's name is Moses. And as Moses comes, he goes to the leader of Egypt, and he talks to him and tries to get him to allow God's people to leave bondage, captivity, to break the chains of sin, the consequence of sin, the things that had held them down and held them captive, to break those and deliver them into the kingdom that was prepared for them. And as he sends Moses, as he talks to the Pharaoh, he goes through this series of plagues. And in Genesis chapter 12, Pharaoh had resisted, like locusts and flies and frogs and all of these things. And finally, God tells him that tonight the death angel will pass through the land of Egypt. And that this will cause the Pharaoh to set the captives free. Okay? So in Exodus chapter 12, verse 1, it says this: the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months." Very important. This is the beginning of months. This is where your timetable starts rolling. He says, "This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for the household." On the 10th day of the first month. Okay? Remember that. Middle note. Right? 10 days is 5 days before what day? The 15th. Yeah, you can spit it out if you know the answer. Just the 15th. It's not a trick question. I know y'all jack with y'all so much, y'all are like, I'm not answering that. Yeah, the 10th day is 5 days before the 15th day. Simple math. It says, take a lamb according to the father's house, a lamb for the household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your account for the lamb. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Make a note, twilight, at twilight on the 14th. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel. So they'll put it on both sides and across. Then they shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted. This is yummy here. Its head and its legs and its inner parts. And you shall eat none of it you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and all of the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the house where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And this shall be a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord, throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. Okay. So what happens here is they take a perfect lamb and they sacrifice the lamb, and they take the blood of that lamb and they redeem their household through the blood of the lamb by painting it out as a marker to the angel of the Lord that passes over the house. The curse that's to the world, the curse to Egypt, becomes the blessing to the children. Isn't that the craziest thing in the world, that this same event for someone is a curse and someone else is a blessing? It's kind of amazing how that happens. So this takes place, and then the next day on the 15th, they began this week of Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay? Now I want you to flip over a little bit further to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is the book of the law. Now what happens after the children of Israel are released? They go out into the desert and God gives them their law. And the book of Deuteronomy tells us that this is the will and the laws of God. And if you live by them, you will have life. And if you don't, you will have death. The obedience to this law is the difference between life and death. The words of my laws or my will is life to you. The will of God from this time of deliverance and being made free, the will of God then becomes life. And His words are life. So He gives them His law, which is His will, which is life for them. So in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 23, verse 4, God is establishing His laws throughout this book. And this is the part where God is establishing His feast and festivals, these celebrations of God. And so in verse 4, we find God's law about this celebration of the Passover. He says, "These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. You shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days, and on the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work." Now, this idea of a holy day, a day set apart, and a day where you do no other work, we would call that what? Sabbath. Because he just says it before that. He says, he establishes in the verses right before that, he establishes every seventh day, we establish a Sabbath, a day of total rest, a day where we do not do any ordinary work. And I think the King James Version even uses the word Sabbath instead of a holy, what was it, convocation? I think the King James actually uses the word Sabbath there. So God establishes that on the 15th day of Nisan, the first month of the year, that on the 15th day, he establishes that this is a Sabbath. Is everybody good with that? And you're sitting there going, I don't really care. Don't really know what you're talking about. Don't really care. You will in a minute, though, because it's going to get cool. Trust me. You trust me? This is fixing to get cool. Okay, let's fast forward. What would we call today in traditional times? Sunday. But what specific? This is a very special Sunday, right? Palm Sunday, right? What is Palm Sunday? Okay, Jesus enters Jerusalem, right? Riding on the colt of a donkey. Why is that? It was prophecy that Messiah would come riding on the colt of a donkey. Okay, instead of a victorious white horse and a king, he's riding into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey. But just a few days prior to this, he had raised this guy named Lazarus to life, and he had been at Lazarus' house, and people had seen this miracle, and they had seen him come in on the colt of a donkey, and they had an inkling that this was it, that he was the Messiah. And so they came and they laid palm branches down. Now, in the book of John, it tells us that this was 5 days prior to Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 5 days before the Sabbath. Okay? Now, we would think 5 days before the Sabbath, we would think that would be the weekly Sabbath of the Saturday. But what did the law tell us? The law told us that in Exodus, it said 5 days before the Sabbath, and we just read that the Sabbath would be on the 15th of Nisan, the first day of unleavened bread, right? Is everybody with me? So 5 days prior to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 15th would be the 10th of Nisan. What happened on the 10th of Nisan in Exodus? The family gathered the sacrificial lamb, right? Isn't it God cool? Like how he's not just kind of in the ballpark, but like he's dead on. 5 days, the book of John says 5 days before the Sabbath, and I would have to assume because of the law that he's referring to the Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that 5 days prior to that would be the day that the sacrificial lamb is gathered, which happens to be what would be the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. But what we're fixing to find out is Palm Sunday might not just be Palm Sunday. I'm going to jack your days all up today, I promise you. Okay? So get the Palm Sunday out and just call it Palm Day for right now. All right? It's the day Jesus enters Jerusalem. And we know that was the 10th of Nisan, 5 days prior to the Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is on the 15th of Nisan, right? Okay, now what happens on the 14th of Nisan? It's actually Passover. They slaughter the lamb. Right? They slaughter the lamb on Passover. Okay, now there's something else you need to know about this whole thing, is that the Jerusalem day doesn't work, the Jewish day doesn't work like our day. Okay, about sundown or twilight, at twilight the day changes. Okay? So at twilight, when it gets dark tonight, it's tomorrow for Jewish people. Now, we start our day at midnight, but we don't call what's going to happen while it's dark tonight tomorrow, does we? We do, I mean, in our minds, we say that's the night that ends this day, because we really only count our days from sunup all the way to sunup, right? Well, they just count theirs from sundown to sundown. So they have night, then day. And if you pay attention, you'll recognize that from Genesis, because in Genesis it says as God is creating, he says it was night and day, and that was the first day. And it was night and day, and that was the second day. So it makes sense from the Jewish perspective, right, that it's night, then it's day. So technically, they're running just 3 or 4 hours ahead of the way we actually think of it, but we don't, our minds say the next morning will be tomorrow and the night that follows that. Why is this important? Because he says at twilight on the day of Nisan, right? On the 14th. The 14th day of Nisan. That's when you sacrifice the lamb. Okay. Where do I go from here? Let me see. Okay, let's do this. Man, I'm at a crossroads. All right, let's just do this because it's easier for me to tell you this. Let's go to Passover week. Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, right? Okay. Jesus meets with his followers. Remember in John that Jesus meets with his disciples in what's called the upper room, and they have a conversation and they share in a meal. All right, when is this meal? Well, there's a lot of debate on when this meal is. Some people say it's this, some people say it's that. But as I was reading through, and you get a timeline, I'm assuming that this meal takes place after sundown because it's into the night as they're having this meal, right? And so they're having this meal on a day, and then all night Jesus goes through these trials. He gets hauled here and hauled there. He goes to the garden to pray, and they arrest him and they take him. Okay, and then into the next day in the afternoon, he's crucified, and he dies, and he dies as he's hanging on the cross, right? Now, what happens is they tell them that he must come off of the cross because you can't hang on the cross on Sabbath. So Jesus must be taken off of the cross on Sabbath because Sabbath is coming. And it's in the afternoon because at twilight Sabbath starts, right? Right. So at twilight Sabbath starts. And then Jesus goes into the grave and then is resurrected on the day after Sabbath on the first day of the week. Right? Is everybody with me? And we would call that Easter what? Easter Sunday, day after Sabbath. Sabbath's on Saturday, right? All right. Now, there's this thing that has jacked me up for 40 years, since I was old enough to add 1, 2, 3. And that thing that jacked me up was that if Jesus had to come off the cross because tomorrow would be a Sabbath, and he resurrected on Sunday, and we call that day of crucifixion, what do we call that? Good Friday, right? Take off school, get out of work. Nobody's against that. I never understood why people didn't want to take the day off because it was a Christian holiday. It's like people that don't... How racist do you have to be to not take Martin Luther King Day off? I mean, I'll take a day off for anything. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. But here's the problem. Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 12, I believe. He's talking he's teaching, and the Pharisees question him and say, we want a sign. And he said, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah, that he spent 3 nights and 3 days in the belly of the whale. 3 nights and 3 days. He didn't say he spent a day and a half. Is this, anybody see where I'm going with this? Does this bother anybody else? How Jesus could be killed on Friday, resurrected on Sunday, and he'd be in the grave for 3 days. Does that jack you up? How do you get killed on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday? Resurrection would be Tuesday. Easter Tuesday? Come on. It doesn't work, right? And the reason it's like that is because for years and years and years and years and years, we had no information. We are enlightened today. Are we not? We don't have to read Greek or know Hebrew. Like, I can get on my computer and I can read Greek and Hebrew right off my computer. I can study, I can find out all the Jewish cultures, all the Jewish traditions. I can find out anything I want to know with a few clicks. I don't have to go to England and sift through books in the basements of libraries for years to figure stuff out. Google, Rabbi Google, that's what my dad calls it. Just go to Rabbi Google, type in your question, and bada bing, an answer. This is amazing. So if we take this Old Testament, the New Testament, if we take all the events and we put the days down, then there are certain things that we know for sure. That is, on the 10th day of Nisan, the lamb is gathered. On the 14th day of Nisan, the lamb is slaughtered, and on the 15th day of Nisan is a Sabbath. Right? Not a weekly Sabbath, right? It's an annual Sabbath for unleavened bread. The first day of the feast of unleavened bread is an annual Sabbath. You have to get that. Okay. So if the lamb is selected on the 10th, at sundown, on the 14th day of Nisan, the start of the 14th day of Nisan, starts Passover, right? The Passover feast, the Passover meal. The Bible says that Jesus gathered with his disciples in preparation of Passover to have this meal. He sits and he has this meal with his disciples. If that meal begins after sundown, then it's actually a meal on Passover, right, on 14 Nisan. That night, Jesus goes through the whole running around between Pilate and Herod, and he is found guilty and sentenced to be crucified. Then he is whipped and beaten. Then he is hung on a cross to die. All right? But we always assume that was a Friday, but it doesn't work out because the prophecy is exact and everything else God done is exact, right? But say that on this particular year, like we have holidays like Christmas. It's on December 25th, right? Now, Christmas would be on like Friday one year, and the next year it'd be on Saturday, next year. No, Tuesday, leap year. That's how I that's why nobody answers. So we know how it works, right? So if this is on 14 Nisan, then the day changes. That's why it's important that this is on a day. Here's the deal. Weekly Sabbath always falls on what day? Saturday, the seventh day of the week, right? Always on Saturday. Always on Saturday. I'm going somewhere. If you're bored right now, just hang in there. It's all right. So say 14 Nisan falls on a Wednesday. Say you're cruising through Tuesday during the day because it had been Tuesday night, and you're coming up to sundown on Tuesday, right? At sundown on Tuesday, we kick into Passover. It becomes Wednesday. Then say all these events take place all through the night, Wednesday night, and into the day Wednesday, and then the Passover lamb is slain on Passover. Does that make sense? Because Jesus didn't tell y'all. Jesus is the Passover lamb. His blood takes away the death angel. Forgot to tell y'all that. That was important. I figured y'all put that together by now. But okay. So say that happens Wednesday. Then by Wednesday night, 14 Nisan, by dark Wednesday night, he must come off the cross Because what happens the next day after 14 Nisan? 15 Nisan, right? What's 15 Nisan? It's an annual Sabbath. And they cannot be crucified hanging on a cross on 15 Nisan. So they take Jesus and they put him in a grave. He's in the grave from sundown of the Sabbath, right? Which is Thursday. Sundown of the day after Sabbath, which is Friday. Till sundown of the weekly Sabbath, which is Saturday. And is resurrected at sundown on the first day of the week. Does that make sense to you? We always assume Jesus was resurrected in the morning, but what we know is they came to the grave in the morning and he wasn't there. Right? And so that's the only way Jesus spends 3 nights and 3 days in the grave. 3 full nights and 3 full days, not a few hours, not resurrected on the 3rd day after. Because that don't work. That's only like 36 hours, right? I mean, it's just like a day and a half at the most you can stretch that into. Then God does something cool, right? The next law, if you read on in Leviticus, the very next law is the law of the festival of first fruits. Guess when the festival of first fruits is? The day after the weekly Sabbath following Passover. So Jesus is resurrected on first fruits. First fruits, the waving of the old mirror, the celebration that the new crops have come, that this is like fulfillment of all of these laws of God, right? Now, that jacks us up pretty bad, right? Because who's going to celebrate Good Wednesday? I want off on Friday. Here's why I tell you all this. Because these are real people in a real place in a real time. This really takes place at a place in history. And this stuff does matter. Because God is exact. And from the beginning of time, He was painting a picture. And His laws are painting a picture. And they're painting a picture of redemption and resurrection and heaven and earth coming back together. And God and man being reconciled. And you and I being redeemed and made right with God. The blood of the Lamb covering the sins of mankind. Making us right with God. And these laws in the Old Testament, they say this is a permanent law. This is for all of us for all time. And if it wasn't fulfilled, then we must still be doing it. But we're not celebrating Passover like that anymore, are we? We're not sacrificing animals and sheep anymore, are we? We're not doing that because Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, to make the law whole. And just as Moses delivered the captives out of bondage, out of slavery and bondage and slavery, just as Moses delivered the captives, the children of God, so the sacrificial lamb of the New Testament on the same days, in the same way, does it for all of humanity, bringing full circle mankind back to Eden. Remember, Jesus kept saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and you and I know it. We know it because we no longer live separated from God, do we? You know what's really crazy? Is that from that day, they start counting off 7 Sabbaths. And on the 50th day is called Pentecost. 50 days from that day. And on Pentecost, the Spirit of God returns and God's home is among his people. And he lives within us, and he dwells among us. And God and you and I are one again. See, these aren't just dates and celebrations and things we go through. It's not just a holiday. This is everything. This is heaven and earth. This is God and man being made right again. This is the return to Eden that we celebrate. This is the end of the earth that we celebrate, where earth and man and God were separated. This is the fulfillment of every law of all of the feasts and the festivals, and God's celebration and God's restoration of mankind through the blood of the Lamb. See, that resurrection, the reason in the Old Testament they would lay their hand on the sacrificial lamb and they would pass their sin into the lamb, and then they would kill their sin and they would offer that blood to God. And they were told, never eat, never touch, do not touch the blood of the sacrifice. Never drink or eat the blood. And Jesus comes, and that night he tells them, he says, this is my blood of the new covenant, drink it. And they're like, and these are Jewish people, right? I mean, that's gross to us. We're like, but to them, this is blasphemy against God. This is the worst of the worst of the worst you could possibly do. And here you have the chosen Messiah, the anointed one, and he's saying, drink my blood. It's the blood of the new covenant. Why is that so important? Because I take my sin blood and I put it into the sacrificial animal and I kill the animal and it makes me clean. He takes my death blood, I take his life blood, his pure, perfect, unblemished blood, and we exchange places and we kill that. The cool thing about Jesus, though, is that first day of the week, that sacrifice comes back to life forever, making my blood pure. No more killing anything. The Lamb was slaughtered and then defeated death, hell, and the grave, defeated sin, overthrew Satan. Man, the whole battle of Armageddon, good and evil, God and Satan and the Messiah and the Antichrist, it all culminates, and Jesus wins and declares victory and resurrects in first fruits, the first of the new world, the first of life. And you read these letters by Paul, and Paul's like, sin and death came through the first man, but the second man we became alive in spirit. Like we're alive, and through the man from heaven, we've become alive with God, never to die again, to be fully alive. And we know that's true. You know it's true. I don't care how old you get, in your spirit, you still feel young. I know our bodies are dying off. I feel that. But inside, don't we still feel like kids? I mean, the older I get, I'm like, I'm still a teenager. I've still graduated high school. I'm young. I feel young. But then I get out and I'm like, oh, everything hurts. Why is this happening to me? We know our bodies get old, but we know we're alive forever, the real you. Not the you we see, but the real you that's deep inside. We know that we're alive forever. And you're alive forever because Jesus was resurrected. Do you get that? See, it's more than a holiday. It's more than a holiday. It was the exact fulfillment of what God had foreshadowed years and years ago. And everybody knew the story, and you knew the story. We've watched the 10 Commandments a million times, man. We know the story, but we put it together. This is the mirror. This is the image. This is what is going on, what's going to be happening in the future for them. and then it happens right before their eyes. Remember Jesus teaching about you'll know the seasons, you'll see the signs? Actually, if they would have looked, they could have figured this out, which year this should have happened. Because all they needed to do was find a day of 15 Nisan that fell 3 days before the weekly Sabbath. Who would have thought it? And why we get all messed up is because we only think one thing and people tell us and we just believe what everybody says. So we never consider. How many of you guys never considered Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday? Like 2 people. Everybody else is just smarter than the rest of us, I guess. They're like, oh yeah, Jesus, everybody knows that. Like what? I freaked out. I was like, there is no way what I'm reading is true. How could everybody be wrong for thousands of years? Well, the people who hold the key to the information don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. That's the problem. The people who knew this don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. That's the problem. And so we just it's got to happen on Sabbath, got to be Saturday, so got to be dead on Friday. You know what I mean? I don't know. I love information. The more information I get, the more I realize that God is dead on all the time. He is not off his game ever. And it is perfect. If you read something in the Bible and it's like, well, that's kind of it, then you're missing it. Because God isn't kind of. He's dead on. It's amazing. It's amazing to me. So as we go out this week, man, I think it's so important that we realize come Wednesday, Tuesday afternoon at sundown, we start to see, wow, this is when everything started to unfold. This is when Jesus goes and eats with his disciples. This is when Jesus heads out to the garden. This is when they start to arrest him. This is when all these things take place. And this is real. This is real. It's real people in a real place and real time in history. And it was foreshadowed years and years before. And we see all these things. There's this one place, I'm going to finish with this. There's this one place where Paul talks about this. I think it's in Corinthians 15. Paul talks about being resurrected, that the resurrection will take place in the twinkling of an eye, and we always think, we're going to be resurrected in the twinkling of an eye. Let me tell you this, I'm pretty sure I'm already resurrected. I was dead and I'm alive, and I don't know what else you'd call that. So, but when you go back and look at it, and the tenses of the words get messed up in translation, but when you go back and look at it, the twinkling of an eye would have been the exact time Jesus was resurrected. You know what the twinkling of an eye is? It's when the first star becomes visible after sundown. That's literally called, the rabbis, that time is known as the twinkling of an eye. And given the 3 nights and 3 days in God's exactness, would have been twinkling of an eye. When the first star appeared would have been the time Jesus was resurrected. The next morning they came, graves empty. You know the rest of the story. So as we celebrate this week, I want you to just hopefully think through it and see these things different. Let me pray for you.